Okay, I think that we'll go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome everyone to Northwest Regional Planning Commission's Essentials of Municipal Planning, Zoning, and Home Act Provisions training. My name's Greta Brunswick. I'm a senior planner here at NRPC, and I have Emily Kloft, a regional planner at NRPC here tonight, who's actually going to be doing most of the speaking. I'm just going to give an introduction. So one of the roles that the Regional Planning Commission plays is to provide education to municipal planning and zoning board members. And this training is a version of what we give annually, typically after, the month after town meeting, when there's likely to be new board members that are volunteering on planning commission, zoning boards, development review boards. And so this year we're splitting the training into two parts. Tonight's focusing on more the planning side and the legislating side, so writing zoning bylaws, and then also focusing on the Home Act provisions that are relevant to municipal zoning. And then next month, we're going to be having a second part to this training focusing on development review procedures and decision writing. So that's part two, and that would be more recommended for the development review board and zoning board members. So it's really good practice or maybe required for new board members to attend this training. Really helpful. I think to join your peers in learning the basics and having a chance to ask some questions, and then also just good practice for seasoned board members as well, to either annually or every so often refresh your knowledge, because there's just so much information when it comes to municipal planning and zoning. I think that each year you're probably learning more and more. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Emily Kloft, who's going to be leading us through the training tonight. I'm assuming we have a mix of Planning Commission and DRB members here tonight from a variety of towns. We're not going to go through and do introductions or anything like that, but I welcome everyone and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Greta. And if you do want to just write your name and the board you're a part of and the number of years you've been in the board member in the chat, that would be great. So we'll do that instead of introductions, just to keep us on schedule here. So again, welcome to the training. We're going to be going over this four sort of topic areas tonight. The first will be planning for a vibrant, sustainable community, which is an overview of some of the planning, talking about roles and responsibilities of municipal boards, implementing the plan. We'll talk just briefly about non-regulatory implementation, and then really talk about drafting zoning bylaws, and then also talk about the Home Act provisions for municipal bylaws. So at the end of each section, I'll stop and wait for questions. If you want to unmute at that point, also feel free to put your questions in the chat as we're going along, and we'll address them at the end of each section. Go. All right, so planning for a sustainable community, vibrant and sustainable. What does it mean for you? Every community, every person's going to have a slightly different idea of what kind of community they want. And really, it's important to understand how municipal planning and zoning land use regulation can help your town get there. So this is an image from Grandma Moses of how she imagined a vibrant community in the early 1900s. And then since that time, those tools that we use to achieve these common community goals have been codified into law through planning and zoning efforts. So the statutory basis for planning and regulation in Vermont is now more than 100 years old. In 1921 was when the Vermont legislature first authorized municipalities to create planning commissions, and then about 10 years later, they authorized zoning regulations. The modern Planning and Development Act that we have today was first created in 1968. And that really created the purposes of planning and zoning, what dictated the contents of municipal plans, the adoption process, and authorized specific types of zoning reviews and regulations. And then in 1988, that was substantially updated, focused on the zoning portion, and in 2004, on the planning portion, and in 2004, focused on the zoning portion of Chapter 117. And then since then, there have been a number of smaller changes. And then just last year, we had the Home Act, which we'll be covering later tonight, which amended Chapter 117 with a focus on increasing housing development. Yeah. So we'll start by talking about municipal plans. So what is municipal plan and why have one? So municipal plan is the guide for accomplishing your shared community aspirations and intentions, considering different areas of the town and how they can be planned as a single unit to meet the needs of the community and develop a community-wide vision. It will dictate things about public investments, land use regulations, and other actions the town can take to achieve its vision. So the real reason to do this is to have a community-wide vision, to empower your community to respond to change in ways that reflect its goals and values, and to designate areas that might be maintained, transformed, or improved. Development can really be planned by anyone in town, and individuals, your businesses, or the municipality, or a combination of all of those. But you never want to just start building something without a plan, and it should be the same for your town. There's also a number of benefits that having a town plan affords you under Vermont legislation. The first is that you can adopt zoning and subdivision regulations, as well as flood hazard regulations, although it should be noted that you don't need a plan for flood hazard regulations, but for zoning and subdivision, you do need to have a plan. As well, Act 250 applications, which are those projects that are reviewed by the state, have to conform to your town plan. And as well as Section 248 Certificate of Public Good, which applies to renewable energy projects, energy generation projects, as well as telecommunication projects. Your town plan will also be considered in those applications. And then you're also more competitive for certain grant applications, including becoming eligible for the Vermont Community Development Program funds. So the planning process is a continuous living document that will cycle through these plan steps over that 8-year planning process. So you'll start by looking at your community, developing your shared vision, identifying community goals and objectives, mapping out the future, and identifying your priority action items. And then once your plan is adopted, you'll move into implementation and review. And it's a good practice to conduct an annual review of your implementation strategies and determine what steps you're going to focus on in the coming year. And review of your plan is especially important as you're coming up on the end of your 8-year cycle and looking at adopting a new plan. And doing those yearly reviews and looking at your implementation yearly will also really help be prepared for that update. So Vermont has a number of goals in legislation for the planning process. That it should be coordinated and comprehensive, that it should involve citizen participation at all levels, consider the use of resources and the consequences of growth and development locally and beyond, and also coordinate and work with neighboring municipalities and the region. So really all of these point to the need to work towards a common vision, including input from the community and coordination with other boards, commissions, and neighboring towns. We have this quote: when it comes to planning, if you're not doing it with people, they think you're doing it to them. People will resist change unless they help initiate it and unless they were involved from the beginning. So what are some methods that you can use for citizen participation? Well, first, you need to think about the type of outreach that you're looking for. For example, you might be looking to inform residents. You could use Front Porch Forum or the town website to inform them of what's going on. You might be looking for input on existing ideas. So you're trying to consult. So you may send out a survey or have a public meeting. You may want to go a step deeper and involve them and generate some new ideas with the public through a workshop or focus group. And then you can even go to something like a charrette, which is can be a very intense participatory process, where the public is actively developing the alternatives and identifying the preferred solution. So you really want to think about what level of information and involvement do we need for this particular plan, for this particular issue, and it's going to depend. But you really
May I
want
ask,
to, yes,
may I ask a question?
yes.
I should have asked this at the beginning. Will these slides be available in a format where I could capture them
Oh.
and print them if I wanted to?
Yes, we'll send out the slides after the meeting, and we are also recording tonight, so that recording will be on our YouTube as well.
I saw that. I'm not
Yes.
a huge YouTube presence, but thank you.
Sure thing. Yeah, we'll definitely send those out. I should have said that at the beginning. Don't panic about needing to write this all down. So what are some really effective ways to engage people in planning? The first is really simple, but talking to people, especially in small towns. Talk to the people who may be directly affected. Talk to the people that you know other people in the community are going to go to for that sort of information, so that you're giving them the most accurate and correct information. If you have in a small town, have each planning commissioner talk to 10 people, for example, you could be looking at like 60, 70 people already that have heard about the project, and news will probably just spread from there. It's also important to meet people where they're at. So, go to places like the senior center or a local cafe or a school, farmer's market, where people already are, to tell them about your project or your plan, rather than expecting them all to show up at a public meeting. People are way more likely to already be in those places and be able to give you feedback, and in a fun, exciting way, which brings us to the food, fun, and celebration. As much as you can, make gatherings a celebration of community. Bring food. You could organize a contest for the planned draft cover. Have pizza or potluck snacks. All things you can do to make it more interesting and enticing for people to come. And then finally, just foster a culture of communication, open communication amongst boards, with the public, with staff, is all going to just encourage people to feel like they know what's happening. If they're being routinely informed, you're less likely to find out down the line that there was a problem that you didn't know about. So now we're moving from talking kind of about how you put together your plan to what is actually in that plan. So there are 12 required areas that all plans have to have. They include land use, transportation, utilities and facilities, education, energy, economic development, housing, flood resiliencies, policies on preserving rare and natural areas, and compatibilities with adjacent municipalities in the region, and an implementation program. One of the new things to note is that with one of the changes that was made to the planning section of Chapter 117 with the Home Act is in relation to housing, which means that you need to include housing data, and as well as a recommended program of action for supporting housing, especially for low-income residents in your town. So that requirement has changed a little under the Home Act, if you were familiar with this beforehand. And these are the requirements, but you can still make your plan your own. You can format it in any way you want, as long as you're including these elements. These don't have to be your chapters, for example. And then there's also the 14 Vermont planning goals, which are an interlocking system of issues that all are supposed to encourage the vibrant and sustainable community. For example, addressing flood resiliency, childcare, transportation, effective land use. So town plans may be consistent with planning goals. They're not required to be consistent with planning goals. However, they shall be consistent with planning goals if they want to seek regional approval, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And consistent in this case means that it doesn't need to conflict. It shouldn't conflict with the goals, and you should be trying to make progress towards attainment. So with all these requirements for the plan, it's easy to just create a plan as a big book of information about your town. But you really want to go beyond that and focus on creating a shared vision for the future of your town. What will it be like in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, for example? So in terms of adopting the plans expire every 8 years. If you have been a board member for longer, you may remember that a couple of years ago, this changed. It used to be 5, it's now 8 years. And then you have to adopt your plan. That adoption process takes several months. It starts with a planning commission hearing that will also include notice to adjacent communities. Then you're going to have 1 or 2 select board hearings. That depends on if you are considered a rural or urban municipality, which is rural is less than 2,500 people and urban is more than 2,500 people. And then decisions on the adoption will be made by the legislative body. So the legislative body would be the select board in most cases, or it might be a village trustees or city council. Unless that body, so the select board or voters, have decided to adopt their town plan by Australian ballot. There are a few communities that do that. Most adopt it through the select board. And plans go into effect immediately upon adoption. So if you follow these steps, that will lead to the adoption of your plan. And then the optional piece is regional plan approval and subsequently regional approval of municipal planning process. So municipalities may request the regional planning commission to approve their municipal plan. And we will approve municipal plans that are consistent with the statewide planning goals, consistent with the regional plan and the plans of other municipalities in the region, and contain all of the required town plan elements. With a approved municipal plan, if you are also engaged in a process to implement the plan, so working on your implementation action steps, and you are your town is maintaining efforts to provide some funds for planning, the Regional Planning Commission will confirm the municipal planning process. And that confirmed municipal planning process will allow your municipality to apply for state designations of downtowns, village centers, new town centers, neighborhood development areas, and growth centers. So all of those state designation programs that you might have heard of, apply for the municipal planning grants, have impact fees, and also have the plans considered by state agencies and state agencies planning. And we meet with our member municipalities once every 4 years to understand how things are going in terms of planning and determine if we can provide any assistance. It's also worth noting that if you are interested in having an enhanced energy plan, which is an additional set of requirements that gives you greater deference during those Section 248 energy projects, the Regional Planning Commission also has an approval process for those enhanced energy plans. And if you're interested in that, you should work with NRPC to talk about the requirements for the enhanced energy plan because they are specific. So the last piece in this section is just a link here, and you'll be able to click this when we send it out after, to the Municipal Plan State Planning Manual, which is a really great resource that talks all in more depth about the process of developing a municipal plan in lots of detail. So it's a great resource for further information. So I'm going to stop here, and if there are any questions, please feel free to just unmute or put it in the chat. Great. Hearing none, I'll move on to the next section here.
Sorry, I have a question.
Oh,
I was a little
yep.
slow with my mute button.
Oh, no worries.
Can you talk more about the benefits of having your town plan adopted by the regional planning body? And give a little background about whether towns in Franklin and Grand Isle are they all universally adopted at this point?
Yes, so every town that currently has a town plan, which is currently every town except for Isle of Mont, they're actually working on one now, but has their town plan in our region approved by the Regional Planning Commission. So the benefits, as I mentioned, were that ability to have your state designation. So for example, Fairfield has 2 designated village centers, and that designation program comes with a couple benefits, most notably the tax credits. availability of tax credits for historical preservation work. And also having that, there are several state grants that having a village center designation, for example, makes you more competitive for. You also need to have a regionally approved plan, a regionally confirmed planning process to apply for the municipal planning grant program, which is that yearly program for all sorts of planning projects, including zoning bylaws, special area plans, things like that. So those are the main two. And like I said, also it allows you to have impact fees, and it has some consideration in the state planning processes.
And then in terms, I can just add to that, in terms of, you know, the bar that municipal plans are held to achieve the regional approval. You know, so we are looking for the minimum requirements to meet state statute, the required elements, and then showing progress towards attainment of the planning goals. And so one of the ways that the Regional Planning Commission looks at, you know, municipal plans and opportunity to, you know, grow or improve over time is more in the form of peer review and commenting. And that's something that the Regional Planning Commission's Plan Review Committee is sort of actually currently working on. So, you know, that framework of sort of early engagement in reviewing plans during the adoption process for sort of more meaningful collaboration across municipalities. But there really is, you know, in terms of receiving that regional approval, there really needs to be, you know, a big bar that's missed, or like a big element that's missed in order to not receive that. And one of the things that we as a regional planning staff do is to sort of try to catch those things prior to the adoption process starting. So we look to do preliminary reviews prior to the adoption process, even if we're not involved in the municipal plan, to try to identify those potential issues, because we're not looking, you know, we want our municipalities to be successful and have plans that are approved.
Thanks, Greta. Any follow-up questions on that? All right, I'll move to roles and responsibilities here then. I think most of us are probably familiar with the three arms of the US government from civics class. In the federal government, we have Congress being the legislative branch that writes the regulations, the Supreme Court being the judicial branch that interprets those regulations, and the administrative being the executive branch, which administers and interprets those regulations. So in a local board, as it relates to planning and zoning, the structure looks a little bit like this. So you have the legislative body, and that can be the select board, it could be a city council, or it could be a village trustees. And then they have legislative function, as does the planning commission, when they write and adopt plans and regulations. You have a quasi-judicial function, which would either be your development review board, or in some commissions, in some municipalities, it may be a zoning board of adjustment and planning commission that takes on that function. And then finally, you have the zoning administrator, who interprets regulations in a non-discretionary way. So to kind of dive into that deeper, the legislative functions of the planning commission are preparing the municipal plan, preparing zoning or development regulations. They also can prepare or edit a capital budget and program, and they may prepare other studies. The legislative body will review, may edit, and adopts or sends to the voters the municipal plan and the zoning bylaws or development regulations, and may prepare or edit or adopt a capital budget and program. In terms of the quasi-judicial function, there are two ways that communities do this. The first is with a unified development review board, where the development review board reviews site plans, subdivisions, conditional uses, lots without frontage, variances, and appeals of ZA decisions. So sort of all of the quasi judicial functions of planning, of zoning. In other communities, that's split between the Planning Commission and the Zoning Board of Adjustment, where the Planning Commission does site plans, subdivisions, and lots without frontage, and the Zoning Board of Adjustment does conditional uses, variances, and appeals of ZA decisions. And we generally recommend having the DRB model because it simplifies the roles of the boards and the process for applicants. They don't need to go to two separate boards, and it allows the Planning Commission to focus on those planning functions primarily. And you can have overlapping membership between a Planning Commission and a Development Review Board. And then for the administrative function, towns with zoning will have a zoning administrator who is usually a municipal staff person whose job it is to issue zoning permits, conduct enforcement of zoning regulations, and assist applicants with any questions they have. And in many communities, they're also responsible for staffing the DRB, PC, or Zoning Board of Adjustments, although that really is up to the municipality on a case-by-case basis. And the zoning administrator's job is to permit zoning regulation applications that are permitted use where there is non-discretionary standards, and they can determine that that use conforms with their required density, dimensions, and uses prescribed in the regulations. And then finally, to do a little demystification of these terms, in common parlance, regulation, bylaw, and ordinance essentially all mean the same thing. In terms of Vermont statutes use the word bylaw specific for zoning, subdivision, and land use regulations adopted in conformance with municipal plans. The word ordinance is used to refer to regulations adopted directly by the select board or other municipal legislative bodies. So you might have things like, for example, a public works standards ordinance or a noise ordinance. And the word regulation is an umbrella term that refers to all types of governmental rules. So within Vermont statute, there are some meaningful differences between bylaws and ordinances. Bylaws allow for pre-existing nonconformities. So use that was already pre-existing is allowed to continue to use, whereas ordinances are effective immediately regardless of prior uses. And bylaws and ordinances also have separate adoption processes outlined in statute. Any questions on that section of roles and responsibilities? All right, I will move forward now to our third section. So our third section is on implementing the municipal plan. So broadly, once you have a municipal plan, you'll have goals and aspirations within it, and you'll want to go about implementing those goals. And we can categorize that type of implementation in either to regulatory, which is rule-based, or non-regulatory. So regulatory implementation usually looks like zoning and subdivision bylaws, a flood hazard bylaw, or ordinances. And then non-regulatory implementation can look like things like improving public facilities, informing and engaging citizens, and supplemental plans. So for example, you might look at a plan for your village area or a plan to improve connectivity as examples. And as of 2016, municipalities need to document that it's actively engaging in the process to implement its plan. So we meet with all of our communities every 4 years. And part of what we ask communities during that meeting is how they're working on implementing their plans. So we can document that and also provide any support or help that you need to work through that implementation goals. So just a little bit here about non-regulatory implementation before we move into talking primarily about zoning and subdivision. Non-regulatory implementation often complement regulatory implementation, and they can also become the focus of the plan. There are some communities that have a plan but no zoning regulations. So there are many options. You can adopt a capital budget and program, or tax stabilization contracts, things that help shape the future and current town spending, obviously in close coordination there with a select board or trustees or council. You can purchase or accept development rights. So accept development rights for conservation or public facilities. A really common one is creating supporting plans which study issues in depth. For example, a detailed plan for a village or evaluating the feasibility of a public wastewater treatment. You can create advisory commissions like a conservation, energy, housing commission to address specific issues of concern to the communities and other projects and studies that your plan recommends. So we won't be going into great detail about non-regulatory implementation here, but there really are a number of options. So moving on to talking about regulatory implementation. So why might a community consider land use regulation as a way to implement the town plan? It can be a very effective way of furthering the plan's visions and goals. For example, if you have a goal to promote compact development in your village, you can implement regulations that ensure that buildings and driveways and streets support this desired pattern of development. Similarly, if you're trying to protect natural resources or minimize the fragmentation and breaking up of farmland, you can limit layout and length of new roads or driveways. You can have lot size standards that are compatible with maintaining large parcels of farm and forest lands. Also, it's worth noting that a concrete benefit of having zoning is that in Vermont, if you are a community without zoning, more things are subject to statewide Act 250 review. Whereas if you have zoning, less things are subject to Act 250 review. So specifically, commercial development in towns without zoning, Act 250 review triggers at 1 acre. In communities with zoning, Act 250 does not come into play until there's 10 acres. And similarly, with a residential subdivision, if you don't have municipal zoning, that at 6 lots, Act 250 will come into play, versus if you do have municipal zoning, that won't occur until 10 lots. So it gives you more local control over those sort of medium scale projects. So these are your local regulations, but there are some concrete limits on what they can do. First, you can't deprive landowners of all reasonable use of their property. If you deprive landowners of every reasonable economic activity they could do on their property without compensation, that would be considered governmental taking. And it's prohibited by the 5th and 14th constitutional amendments. There have been over 25 high-profile court cases that have clarified what a reasonable use of property means. And one of the important tests is whether the law denies a property owner of all economically viable use of the land. There are lots of details here, and this has even come up with Vermont municipalities in the past. It came up in South Burlington, for example. Additionally, in Vermont, Vermont is what's called a Dillon's rule state as opposed to a home rule state. And that means municipalities can only regulate what is specifically enabled in Vermont statute. So what is in that chapter 117 tells us what you can and cannot regulate. As an example, one thing you can't regulate is uses that are agriculture as defined by the statute. And that is, there are specific limitations on local regulations that are outlined in section 4412 and 4413 of chapter 117. These can include things like treating all housing types equal and not discriminating against ADUs and multi-unit dwellings, protecting home occupations and home daycares, treating mobile homes as on a lot as equal to any other single unit use of that lot. Ensure the continuation of certain nonconformities, allowing the development of lots without frontage, and not allowing local regulation of accepted agricultural and silvicultural forestry practices, as well as not allowing regulation of applications requiring a certificate of public good. So all of these are important to keep in mind as you're drafting your zoning regulations. So what are the types of review that you can have within your zoning regulations? Well, zoning regulations can broadly enable different types of land review that are related to land development. And land development is defined very broadly. It can involve the subdivision of a parcel into 2 or more parcels. It can involve construction, reconstruction, alteration, or enlargements of buildings and structure. It can involve mining, excavation, and landfills, and it can also involve a change of use of any building or structure or land. So it has to do both with subdivision, with changing structures, and with changing uses. So there are these are the common types of review that you'll find in your municipal bylaw. The first is permitted uses, which are permitted administratively and are allowed by right. So a common example of this is a single unit home might be allowed by right in your bylaws. A conditional use is a use that can be established if found compatible. So it considers the external impacts of the use and the compatibility with the surrounding land use. Site plan review looks at some internal impacts of use by looking at the design of the specific parcel, things like the internal layout and traffic flow. Variances are allowances for relaxation of dimensional standards for structures in very specific uncontrollable circumstances. Variances are laid out by state statute, and they are very rarely granted in Vermont. So that's something important to understand. In contrast, you have waivers, which allow for relaxation of specifically defined rules in your bylaws, as long as there is a clearly defined process and standards for how the waiver will be applied. So those are generally a more flexible standard, but they still do need to have a clear process laid out. Some communities may have planned unit development, which allows for a flexible development plans for a specific project. Some rules may be modified as sort of a carrot to implement good site design. A common form of this would be a conservation planned unit development, where allowing lots and units to be clustered on a smaller lot than would be normally allowed in return for conserving some land. And then just generally subdivision, which is controlling the pattern of future development by having standards for how divisions of parcels are allowed. So this is the sort of layout for what happens when an application is received. So when your zoning administrator receives an application, they will determine whether it is an administrative application, so something like a permitted use, or in some communities, some subdivisions and site plans may also be administratively approved, or if it needs to be reviewed by the DRB or the ZBA and PC. And then if it's an administrative review, the zoning administrator is going to look at those non-discretionary standards and either issue or deny a permit, which then leads to an opportunity of appeal to a DRB or ZBA. Or if they determine that it is a quasi-judicial application, the DRB or ZBA and PC will conduct the review, issue a decision, and then again, an opportunity for appeal. So a sort of appeals process is laid out here. It can be at either the local or the state level. So if the project starts with the decision of an administrative officer, then that first layer of appeal would be to the DRB or the ZBA. And then the decision of the board, whether it started at the administrative officer and was appealed, or whether it started as a decision of the board because it was a use that required that quasi-judicial review from the beginning, could then be appealed to the Superior Court environmental decision. So the applicant or any interested parties always have the ability to appeal the act or decision of the ZA or of any quasi-judicial board. Something else to understand about when cases go to the Superior Court Environmental Division, which you'll often hear referred to as environmental court, is that they hear the court cases de novo unless the municipality has adopted the Municipal Administrations and Procedures Act. In our region, that's only Montgomery. So what that means is that they hear the cases completely from the start, not taking any of the information that was gathered in the municipal level, but instead all the information is regathered, all of the party determinations are made at that environmental division of the Superior Court level. When your local decisions are appealed to that environmental court, you are not required to defend your decision or put in an appearance, although we do recommend that you do so in order to defend your zoning bylaws. So who can appeal a zoning decision? So under 24 VSA section 4465, those can appeal are interested persons. So that includes the applicant, the municipality or an adjoining municipality, property owners in the immediate neighborhood of the subject proposal, and a petition of any 10 persons who can be a combination of voters, residents, and property owners, any department or administrative subdivision of the state owning property or interest, and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. This is another change with the Home Act, is that they added resident to the group of people who can appeal the decision. So that was on top of voters and property owners. So to appeal to the, for an interested person to appeal, they must meet one of these categories, and they need to have participated in at least one of the hearings. And this includes a written participation. So if they wrote like a letter to the Development Review Board ahead of time saying their opinion and sent it to them, as well as attending. So local boards do need to document attendees at public hearings and whether they are seeking interested party status. And those who are should be sworn in. But you don't need to make the decision of whether they actually are an interested party. You can leave that up to the environmental court in case of appeals, unless you are in the town of Montgomery, in which case you do actually need to make that determination.
Emily, if I may,
Yes.
does this include Zoom participants?
Yes.
Thank you.
It would include, if you're doing a hybrid or virtual model, it would include anyone participating via Zoom. So you should make sure that if you have a DRB hearing happening and there's people via Zoom, that you get their names and take down that same information. So the DRB or the ZBA and PC, once they've made a decision, this is some initial information about regulatory decisions, and I highly encourage you to attend our May training if you want more information on decision writing. But decisions should be in writing and contain the findings of fact on which the decision is based and the conclusion of law on how the bylaw applies based on those facts. And these are the board's responsibilities, not the interested parties or anyone else at the hearings. They should be based on the review standards in the bylaws. Minutes may suffice for a written decision if they contain all of the required elements. And the board is a board that deliberates in public. And it should memorialize the concurrence of the majority of the board. So it doesn't have to say who voted for and against. It just needs to state the opinion of the majority. And the quasi-judicial panel must issue that written decision within 45 days of the close of the final public hearing. So it does not need to be the same night as the hearing. You have time to write that decision. And you should think in your community about who is responsible for preparing decision, especially if it's done by a volunteer board member. It's a big responsibility to have decisions prepared, and you want to make sure that they're being done accurately so that your decisions hold up and you can reduce the likelihood that they'll be appealed. So if you're interested in learning more, there is the Vermont Land Use Planning Implementation Manual. It is a really in-depth resource. It is unfortunately an older resource. So if you're looking at specific statute, you should always go to statute to reference that as well, because there have been some changes there. But it does provide a great number of information and topic papers on regulatory and non-regulatory implementation strategies. Any questions on that section? Okay. So not hearing any now. I'll move to the last section, which is specific to the Home Act, Act 47, that was adopted last year, specifically regarding the provisions on local zoning regulations. And this presentation was prepared in cooperation with the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development and the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. So first of all, why was the Home Act adopted? It's part of a multi-pronged approach to mitigate the housing crisis, understanding that some housing zoning policies can result in exclusion of housing types, and a desire to really encourage growth in the areas with existing public utilities and services, and rather than having that growth potentially sprawl out into all the areas that we want to protect, finding access and opportunities to for more affordable homes and new neighbors by looking at how we can change local regulations. So the Act did make significant changes to some housing language, but really most local regulations remained unchanged. And this particular presentation is really focusing on local zoning regulations, but there were some other changes that came about with the Home Act that can be found on the state website. So a key factor to understanding the Home Act is that there are two sets of standards. The first are provisions that apply to all areas and all municipalities, in municipalities that plan and regulate with zoning. And the second are policies that only apply to areas served by municipal water and sewer. So in our region, communities that have areas with municipal water and sewer are St. Albans Town and City, Swanton, Sheldon, Enosburg, and Richford. So that second set of provisions will only apply to the portions of those communities with municipal water and sewer. So what does apply to everyone? Provisions on duplexes, accessory dwelling units, the use of hotels or motels as shelters, the option for administrative review of minor subdivision, by right development of review of housing, and changes to appeals and interested persons, which we talked about in section 3, which included residents in the group of people that can appeal. So one of the biggest changes for all communities for the Home Act was requiring duplexes, which are defined as a residential building with 2 dwelling units in the same building, to be allowed in all districts that allow year-round residential uses. So they must be an allowed use, which can be permitted and or conditional, although our recommendation is to make them a permitted use. And they must have the same or not more restrictive dimensional standards as single household dwelling. So for example, if you have a 1 acre minimum lot size, for example, for a single household dwelling, a single family home, then you're going to want that, you need to have that same 1 acre lot standard for a duplex. For accessory dwelling units, the statute created a definition using the existing language. So this language already existed, it just codified it into a definition, which defined an accessory dwelling unit as a distinct unit subordinate to the single family dwelling on an owner-occupied lot with wastewater capacity and sized up to 30% of the floor area of the main unit or 900 square feet, whichever is larger. So those are important to know, especially if your bylaws are older. That might not be in your bylaw, but all of these changes are effective and should be if you have an application that comes in for an accessory dwelling unit, you should be following these standards. And ADU review for dimensional standards or any other regulations cannot be more restrictive than that for single unit dwellings. So statute already prohibited conditional review for any type of ADU, but this also clarifies that there can be no other special review standards that would, other than those who would apply for a single family use of property. So for example, if you don't have a special design review for a single unit dwelling, you can't have a special design review for an ADU. It just has to be treated exactly the same. The Act also makes it clear that you're allowed to convert an existing detached non-residential building, such as a carriage barn, into a habitable space for an ADU in a manner that's not more restrictive than how you would for a single unit dwelling without an ADU. Municipalities can continue to be more permissive than the statewide minimum, for example, allowing a larger ADU or having less restrictive standards. And then finally, for the purposes of fire safety code, it clarifies that ADUs are not considered public buildings unless they are being rented out publicly. So in regards to hotels and emergency shelters, as we know, during the pandemic, the state rented out hotel and motel rooms for emergency shelters. And this makes it clear that bylaws cannot prevent or penalize hotels that are renting rooms on which rooms are being rented for the purposes of Vermont General Housing Assistance. Similarly, in terms of shelter, it creates a definition of shelter being temporary shelter for the homeless, and says that shelters must be regulated similarly to other state or community owned and operated institutions, which means they cannot interfere with the daily or seasonal operations of a shelter or otherwise interfere with the functional use of a shelter. So the intention of this is to limit regulations that could be barriers to supporting the unhoused population. So one of the things that the Home Act enables for all communities, and this is not a requirement, it's just something that it enables, which is that you can have administrative review of minor subdivisions. So that means the zoning administrator reviews and approves the application rather than the subdivision going to your development review board or your planning commission. So this is an opt-in provision. Municipalities have to opt into this by writing it into their zoning bylaws, and communities are also allowed to define what a minor subdivision is. So this is something some communities were doing already, and it was sort of a legal gray area previously, and this just makes it clear that municipalities are allowed to do this. So for example, in some communities, municipalities will decide to allow their zoning administrator to permit boundary line adjustments or two-lot subdivisions that don't necessarily need to go before a review board. And then this provisions on by right development review are really intended to ensure that anyone trying to develop new housing has clear standards set out for them. So it says that when you're going through a development review process, so for example, conditional review or a site plan review, your board is not allowed to impose conditions that would reduce lot sizes, reduce building footprint or height, reduce dwelling unit density, increase parking, or any other standard that or any other modification to that type of standard in an application that complies with the minimum or maximum standards in the bylaw. So for example, if your community has a height restriction of 35 feet, you can't, as a conditional use for a housing project, say your condition is that the building can't be higher than 30 feet. Or similarly, if you allow for 3 units an acre in a particular 3 units on a lot in a particular district, you can't say actually you can only have 2 as part of the conditional use review. So what this means is that you need to have those standards codified into your bylaws rather than using that review process where it doesn't provide the applicant clarity on what actually is or isn't allowed. And so finally, there are also some changes to bylaw adoptions and filings. So previously, some rural towns had voted to have all of their municipal bylaws approved by Australian ballot. So all of them going out to the voters for to approve. And that is no longer, but rural towns can no longer vote to do that. And the only case where it would go to Australian ballot is if the select board essentially decided to forward it to the townspeople to vote. There's also a new form that the state has put together for bylaw adoption that talks about where you have to talk about how your bylaw conforms to sections 4412, 4413, and 4414. And all of the bylaws and the new adopted bylaw report form must be filed with the department upon adoption. And here is the link to that. And they're also collecting all of the zoning files to have a statewide collection of all of those zoning districts. So the idea of this is to enhance fair housing reporting and the GIS upload of zoning districts. So I'm going to pause there because we're at the end of the section that applies to all communities. So I want to answer any questions that people might have on this section before moving to the next.
Can I go back to the section on Board of Appeals, zoning Board of Appeals, and who writes the decision?
Yes.
Seen situations where the zoning administrator writes the decision, and there seems to be a conflict of interest, I would think, since they've already made a decision on it. Now they're kind of making a conflicting report.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally your decision should reflect the opinion of the board, not of the zoning administrator. So in that way that they are only sort of acting in an administrative function to write down what the board believes. But I can see how that might be perceived as a
Right.
conflict.
So in the situation where it's the DRB is hearing an appeal of the ZA's decision, that is an instance where the ZA should not fulfill the role of writing the decision in that instance. So the board needs to have a plan for that.
Yes.
For an whether it's a board member stepping up or an alternate staff member to take the role of decision writer in the case of a zoning administrator appeal.
I agree.
Emily, can you revisit the second to last slide in this section regarding I can't pull out the statutory site, but you were talking about the limitation that essentially says you can't make increased there we go, 4464. Can you talk more about this? I'm not sure I followed what the gist of this aspect of the regulation is.
Yeah, so essentially for allowed housing projects, you can't, through your conditional review process, for example, or through a site plan review, increase your standards beyond what's actually written in your zoning bylaw. So for example, if in your zoning bylaw, you have a parking minimum of 2 spaces per unit, you can't go to the applicant and say, actually, for this project, we're really concerned about parking. We'd like you to add 3 spaces per unit. So the goal of this is to provide more clarity to applicants before they're going in on whether or not their project is going to be approved, and that if it meets those standards that are written in the zoning bylaw. And there are some exceptions to this. For example, if you have a clearly written standard that relates to something like, for example, like a wetlands, for example, or some other natural resource constraint, there can be some exemptions to this. But in general, the idea is to provide clarity to applicants going in on what is and isn't allowed based on the bylaws, rather than allowing this sort of uneven approach where with each project being reviewed, the applicant is getting a different sort of standard.
So for housing developments, I think board members or planning commissions and writing bylaws really need to be, prescriptive in the standards that they want to apply for housing developments. It's not something that can be decided on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the specific project is or where it's located by the board in a conditional use or hearing. So those standards need to be written into the bylaw and followed. They can't be, decided on or placed as conditions on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's just to ensure that that housing projects are subject to sort of prescriptive and equal standards.
Yeah, it's really important to understand this when you're drafting your zoning bylaw, and not try to rely on that conditional use review to potentially disallow things that aren't appropriate for your community. You should be proactively thinking through those in drafting. Any other questions on this section? All right, so I'll move on to talking a little bit, just briefly about the areas, regulations that apply to areas with municipal water and sewer. This will be sort of an abbreviated version since this doesn't apply to all of our communities. But if you are in one of those communities, we really do encourage you to reach out if you have follow-up questions. So first of all, what is an area with municipal water and sewer? It means areas where you have municipal water or sewer, which can also be from a fire district, where you have available connection. It covers municipal water and both direct and indirect discharge wastewater systems. So it doesn't require connections in areas that are prohibited by a state regulation or a permit, identified capacity constraints, areas where year-round housing development isn't allowed, for example, like in an industrial park. And municipalities may also adopt a sewer district if they don't have an ordinance currently, or update an existing one to clearly identify connection limits. And we do recommend identifying connection limits based on your capacity and the distance from existing infrastructure, as that will make enforcing these regulations easier. So what applies to these areas? First, starting in December, minimum parking requirements. Also, and then the rest of these are currently active, which are allowing 3 to 4 unit multi-units, an allowed dwelling unit density of 5 units per acre, and affordable and mixed use dwelling unit densities, and a height bonus for affordable or mixed unit dwelling. So first, for all municipalities with water and sewer, so if you have minimum parking requirements, they can be no more than 1 car per dwelling unit, but you may require 1.5 spaces for multiple unit dwellings in areas that are not near public parking or not served by water and sewer. And this becomes effective December 1st, 2024. And this does not affect your ordinance authority, for example, to regulate parking nuisances like ticketing for parking in authorized places or having a winter parking ban, for example. So then the multi-unit and density and height bonus. So the Act defines multi-unit to be 3 or more dwelling units in the same building. And the 3 or 4 units in communities and areas with water and sewer must be a permitted use, not conditional. So you have to permit 3 and 4 units as a permitted use in areas with water and sewer. Additionally, there is a provision for affordable housing projects and affordable housing projects that are mixed use, which allows for a dwelling density bonus of 40% above what's written in your bylaws and 1 habitable floor above the height maximum that's listed in your bylaws. So those are expansions beyond what is allowed in the bylaws, again, if you have water and sewer. So also in areas with water and sewer, bylaws have to establish lot and dimensional standards that allow 5 or more dwellings per acre for each allowed residential use. So this is actually a density that we already see in many of our areas that have water and sewer. For example, this is an image of Swanton showing an area with a density of 5 units per acre. So you can regulate this via minimum lot size, or you can regulate this separate from minimum lot size, although you should remember that duplex and single units must have the same dimensional standards. So for example, if you had a single unit dwelling, you could have 0.2 acre minimum lot size, which would meet 5 units per acre. You would also need to allow 5 duplexes on the same lot size based on the provision that the single units and duplexes have to have the same lot size. So that is just a basic introduction to that this is a complicated provision for a lot of communities, and happy to answer any follow-up questions that people have on that. And there are some support options for municipalities each year. We have municipal planning grants. We also had this past year bylaw modernization grants for the past 2 years to assist communities with updating their bylaws to support housing opportunities. We at your Regional Planning Commission are always available for technical assistance questions. And then there are also several resource pages specific to the Home Act. Any questions about that or anything else in the presentation that you didn't get to ask before?
Quick question.
Yep.
Is there any condition for municipalities that have municipal water, but they have on-site sewage that is conventional?
Yeah, so they would not have to meet any of the standards that we just talked about. Those standards are only for communities with municipal water and sewer. I mean, you can always be less restrictive, like if you wanted to be less restrictive in your zoning bylaws, of course that's allowed, but you're not required to meet those standards unless you have both water and sewer.
With no more questions, I would want to tune everyone's attention to our next two trainings. On April 29th, we're Catherine Dimitrick, the director of NRPC, is holding an open meeting law training. So I recommend everyone attend that. It's a really great training that she does every year, and it's appropriate for all boards, all public bodies in the municipality that are, you know, that are conducting open meetings. So select boards, DRBs, planning commissions, and any other subcommittees even that might be operating as public bodies under the open meeting law. And then on May 22nd, that's when we're going to be holding the second part of the municipal board member training, focusing on development review procedures, processes, and decision writing. But that's all we have for you tonight.
Yep, thank you all. And we'll be following up with the meeting slides as well as with a survey on your opinion on the training, and we greatly appreciate if you take the time to fill that out. It helps us improve our trainings. Have a good night,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. Have a good night.